Like Marx, Kierkegaard's philosophy is a reaction to the Hegelian synthesis, the idea that philosophy had pretty much closed up shop once Hegel had put together the ultimate, or comprehended the ultimate purpose or goal of human life. Hegel's encyclopedic system was a kind of end to philosophy if you accepted the arguments that he made. And Kierkegaard hated everything about the Hegelian system. He hated the smug certainty of it, the kind of megalomaniacal comprehensiveness of it, the rationalism of it, and what he really disliked most perhaps was the Greek Promethean element of this rationality. In other words, there's a kind of splitting of the difference between Athens and Jerusalem, between reason and faith in Hegel's system, or if he doesn't split the difference, he reconciles them in a way that Kierkegaard found altogether too pat, inconsistent with his own experience of both reason and religion. Now, Kierkegaard is surely one of the most morbid and emotionally disturbed writers in the history of Western philosophy. I really like him. I find him really fascinating. He's certainly one of the funniest, and he has a thoroughly morbid sense of humor. There are so few philosophers with a good sense of humor. Kierkegaard is one of them. So if you get a chance to read this, read it with a sense of humor, and I think that you'll appreciate it a great deal more. Now, what Kierkegaard thinks is that it's impossible to completely systematize human existence. It is possible to give a good, rational, coherent account of the purpose of human life. And in fact, he thinks that the problems here are from the mixture of Promethean, humanistic Greek rationality and the strictly understood tradition of biblical faith and religion. In other words, Kierkegaard is going to reformulate the problem that's been around since the time of Augustine at least, of connecting faith and reason, but only at the cost of undermining reason, undermining the Greek element in the Western intellectual tradition, and becoming something like a modern Job, God's faithful servant, the man who will not blaspheme, who will not be skeptical of God and his wisdom, regardless of what the circumstances are. Now, Kierkegaard believes that the orientation that a person takes to the world determines their behavior, determines their activities, determines the level of human existence that they may rise to. And what's worse than this is that Kierkegaard has confronted the problem of religious faith, and he is unwilling to look away and accept any of the facile compromises between reason and faith. The kind of whistling through the dark that we get with Hegel, that they're all both really the same, and that Christianity can be easily reconciled with Greek rationalistic philosophy. Strictly speaking, Kierkegaard says no. You must make a choice between one and the other. So then the question comes, which are we to choose? Are we to choose the life of faith or the life of rationality? Are we to choose an orientation towards nature as our main ontological assumption, or are we going to go with nature plus? Nature plus, in this case, heaven. Nature plus some metaphysical realm. So we have to choose between naturalistic ontologies and metaphysical ontologies. We have to choose between Athens and Jerusalem. We have to choose between religious faith and rational certainty. And the question is, what criteria could we possibly offer for either decision that we were to make? And to make the question even more difficult, what possible grounds for this judgment could we offer that doesn't presuppose what it's trying to prove? In other words, if you presuppose a naturalistic ontology, and if you presuppose that rationality is the key human fact, and that you want to orient your philosophy towards human life rather than some sort of metaphysical construct, well then you can start there and then show that it makes sense to have a naturalistic ontology and a humanistic orientation towards life and to emphasize rationality. If, on the other hand, you want to adopt a position like that of, say, St. Augustine or Luther, who think that if there's a conflict between reason and faith, well, then faith wins out every time. Luther, Augustine, people like that, prefer the metaphysical ontological conception. They prefer to emphasize faith as opposed to reason. They prefer to emphasize the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem as opposed to the tradition that comes out of Athens. Now, if you presuppose that the Bible is God's authoritative and divine word, if you assume that the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem is the true revelation of God's intentions, if you assume that the life of faith is superior to the life of reason, well, then it won't be hard thereafter for you to prove that the life of faith is superior to the life of reason. In other words, you have to make a choice between these two sets of alternatives, between the profane and the sacred, between Athens and Jerusalem, between a human-centered conception of the world and a God-centered conception of the world. And everybody makes such a choice. The difficulty is when you ask them why they make such a choice, right, they can't give you any explanation that doesn't presuppose what it is that they're trying to prove, because the orientation is built into their justification, to the legitimation of that choice. So Kierkegaard, like any good philosopher, like anyone who's morbidly introspective, decides that he's going to try and dig deeper, get to the real foundation of this problem, figure out how we're going to be able to choose between the life of faith and the life of reason. And for Kierkegaard, he can simplify it somewhat by talking about the actual orientation, the actual thing that a given person desires. And he says that the big choice in life between the humanistic and the divine, or between Athens and Jerusalem, is whether you are oriented towards the pleasurable life, what he calls the aesthetic life. And under the aesthetic life, what he means is both physical, sensual pleasures, sex and alcohol and, any physical, sensual pleasure. In addition to that, as a component of the aesthetic life, there is also the intellectual pleasures. In other words, he does not leave out the intellectual hedonists, as so many philosophers like to. So when he talks about the aesthetic life, the life in pursuit of pleasure, he's talking essentially about the Greek life, the life of rationality. Not rationality necessarily in the Kantian sense, more likely rationality in the sense that Hume uses it, instrumental rationality. Rationality used as a means to satisfy our desires. Our desires may be the physical satisfaction of our pleasure neurons, or it may be intellectual satisfactions that we get from reading works of philosophy. It is entirely possible to be an aesthetic man and not have a scandalous sex life. You may take out your aesthetic desires in the realm of art. If you frequent art galleries regularly and that is your main solace in life, that's the greatest pleasure you get, you are still an aesthetic man because your orientation is towards pleasure, whether it is physical or whether it is mental or intellectual. And Kierkegaard believes that that is natural to human beings, that we are born into the world of the flesh, the world of space and time, and that the natural, rational orientation of human beings will be the pursuit of pleasure, either physical or intellectual. And as a matter of practical fact, if you look back in history, it's not hard to find people that like pleasure. It's not even hard to find them now. It is a natural state of human affairs. This unfortunate tendency, this fact that we are born into the aesthetic life, or that it is the most natural and, in the sense of natural reason, the most reasonable choice that human beings, particularly untutored human beings, can make, Kierkegaard thinks that that's the analog of original sin. We are born into this world with a natural predisposition towards following the aesthetic life. That shows how depraved we are. So Kierkegaard believes that, because he's a profoundly religious thinker, that we must make a choice between the life of pleasure and the ethical life. That's the other alternative. And what he means by the ethical life is the person who pursues moral righteousness independent of pleasure. What he means by moral righteousness is the person that follows ultimately God's divine law. Whether they recognize it immediately or not, he thinks that all real ethical judgment, all ethical judgment that isn't a way of patting ourselves on the back and telling ourselves not only how virtuous we are, but how clever we are, to be able to discern the ultimate foundations of human virtue. All right? Well, Kierkegaard says that the only real alternative to the life of pleasure is the life of the ethical man, the person who follows moral rules for their own sake. In this respect, he has many connections to the Kantian project. Both Kant and Kierkegaard are trying to negotiate this maze of elements from the Athenian and the tradition that comes from Jerusalem. And whereas Kierkegaard finds a beautiful and profound synthesis which doesn't abdicate the reasonable and rational responsibilities of the philosopher, Kierkegaard does give that up. He departs from Kant. He goes towards the life of pure faith, in which reason is either superfluous or a distraction. So for Kierkegaard, there is a definite hierarchy in human existence. There are better and worse choices. And the fundamental choice that all human beings must make is between the aesthetic and the ethical life. So now the question emerges, what standard can we come up with that will allow us to kind of cover this whole area, the whole set of alternatives, which will allow us to decide which is the best thing to do? And here's where Kierkegaard makes an important contribution to philosophy. He is often considered as one of the founding members, one of the most important precursors to what in 20th century philosophy is called existentialism. He says that individual human beings, in the particular place and time that they exist, must make a choice between the aesthetic life and the ethical life. And he puts this together in a book called Either Or. It's 2 volumes. The first volume is the either. The second volume is the or. The either is the aesthetic life. The or is the ethical life. You are faced with a choice, and it must be either or. You cannot create a pragmatic compromise which splits the difference between the two. If you do that, you are the aesthetic man par excellence, because you wouldn't want to deny yourself the pleasure of having a kind of dilettante's connection to religion. So no, he's hard shell about it in the way that Kant is. Either or. You are either an aesthetic person or you are a moral person, an ethical person, and there is no happy middle ground. There is no potential for compromise. So we are forced to a profound and terrifically consequential decision. What makes Kierkegaard a precursor to existentialism is that he holds the view that there is no criterion for making this decision. In other words, he faces us with the grim, the horrifying reality of criterionless choice. Make a decision. You have no standards upon which to make your decision. Good luck. And you also have no choice about whether you make the decision or not. You must decide. Best of luck. So Kierkegaard leaves us adrift. He cuts us off from our moorings to rationality because he says there is no possible rational decision procedure which could give you grounds for choosing the moral or the aesthetic life. If you want to say that you've developed some rational theory which shows you that only the rational life is the good one, you are presupposing what you are trying to prove. If you didn't presuppose that rationality would be our guide, then what would you say? Nothing. The vast silence of human existence becomes very, very clear when Kierkegaard begins to meditate and think deeply about the choices that human beings must, by virtue of the human condition, make. What is agonizing, what is awful about this decision is that you have no grounds for making it. And you have to make it, and your soul is depending upon it. Your felicity is depending upon it. It's the most important choice in human life, and you have no star to steer by, and never will. What a horrible universe he's created for us. What a terrifically difficult set of problems he faces us with. And he will accept no compromise, either or. You can see how he disdains Hegelian synthesis of any kind, because Hegel would say, we'll get a little bit of this, we'll get a little bit of that, we'll get a thesis, an antithesis, we'll synthesize. Hegel says, no synthesis, no compromise, this or that. Decide which. If you refuse to decide, well, you started out as an aesthetic man to begin with. You were born in the state of nature. People naturally pursue pleasure. If you don't want to decide, we know where you stand. You've decided already. So we're stuck with the ultimate theological problem, and we have no way of solving it. Now, Kierkegaard's book, Either Or, is remarkable for its literary virtues. It is a wonderful, a beautiful book. It is also a kind of harrowing, frightening book. And it is obviously a book produced by a tortured individual. A man who thinks about things like this all the time and who manages to come up with this sort of problem is not a happy person. Even when he finds God, the irony and the cynicism, he wrote his doctoral dissertation on irony, on Socratic irony. The whole book is an ironic treatment of irony. His supervising professors found it enormously unpleasant. They said, you're an awfully impressive guy, but I never want to read anything like this again. And it's understandable. Have a look at it and you'll see what he's saying. Irony is one of the things that Kierkegaard relishes so much, because having put himself through this harrowing theological experience, he feels that it is very difficult for him to explain to people what the significance of the ultimate moral theological choice is. He feels that people that haven't suffered for what they believe almost have no right to it, that you earn your deserts, that you earn your stripes as an intellectual by not only thinking problems through, but feeling them through. Kierkegaard is writing in the first part and the middle part of the 19th century. He is one of the great examples of theological romanticism. And of course, that's connected with the entire romantic reaction to the Enlightenment and to the rationality that's central to the Enlightenment. Romantic thinkers romantic thinkers is almost a contradiction in terms. Romantic intellectuals like feeling over reason. They like grand and beautiful emotions. They emphasize sentiment. If you think of Charles Dickens's novels, if you think of Berlioz's music, too much of everything. They have no sense of proportion, but they have lovely sentiments. Well, Kierkegaard has no sense of proportion and has very frightening sentiments. They have horrific sentiments, but they have their unique appeal. So in the volume 1, in the Ether, he presents some very arresting images. He writes from the perspective, in the first volume of the Ether, he writes from the perspective of the aesthetic man and explains to us what it's like to be us, as if we didn't know. And in fact, Kierkegaard thinks that we don't know. He thinks that we don't entirely comprehend the wretched state of the purely natural aesthetic man. I think it's T.S. Eliot that once wrote a line describing the hollow men, I believe. He said that they're distracted from distraction by distraction. Well, Kierkegaard thinks that that's what the life of the aesthetic man is. It's one distraction after another to prevent you from seeing the vacuum of your existence, to prevent you from looking right at the void and being turned into stone. He says that's why you pursue pleasure and novelty all the time, because the real evil or the real misery in the life of the aesthetic man is boredom. Kierkegaard says, and I think it's one of the greatest lines in the history of philosophy, it's beautiful and it's horrifyingly true. He says that boredom is the root of all evil. Think about that. It's much more dangerous than money. Think about the amount of evil that is introduced into the world by people's simple desire for sensation. And Kierkegaard, of course, in his own inimitable and most unkind, ironic way, talks about the history of boredom in a piece called The Rotation Method. It's sometimes translated as the rotation of crops. And he describes the origins of boredom. It's beautiful. He said God created man because he was bored. Adam was alone. He was bored. He asked for Eve. Adam and Eve were bored together. They had some children. Then they were bored en famille. And then people multiplied and reproduced. And then they were bored en masse. And everywhere boredom took over the world. Eventually people created the Tower of Babel, which is an idea that is as boring as the tower is high. And the reason they did that is sheer boredom. That's the only reason people put together culture at all. It's boring. The world is full of nothing. And that we fill this nothing up with trivialities like human culture. Oh, you feel the breath of infinite spaces in this guy. He lives in a kind of interstellar space of the soul. It has nothing in it. And he says, the problem is that you think that about me because I'm such a perverse writer, but in fact it's all true about you. And that's what your life amounts to. And that's what it means to make the aesthetic choice. This leads to two possible things. It leads to a continuation of it where you die on your own. With the more impressive self-consciousness on the part of the aesthetic man, they choose something a little bit more stylish, a little bit more tasteful. They commit suicide. Kierkegaard believes that if anyone were to actually become conscious of what it means to be an aesthetic man, to be constantly pursuing new flavors, new tastes, new sensations, new experiences, you would just get it over with now. It's so horribly boring that the boredom would drive you just to exterminate yourself. That's the active rather than the passive form of the aesthetic man. Now, in addition to this either, and it's a grim either, before I get beyond the either, he has a very arresting image that's worthy of Nietzsche. As a matter of fact, there are few people that I would be willing to place in the same intellectual league with Nietzsche, but for simple perversity, For a simply morbid approach to the world, I would say that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are very close. I mean, one believes in God, the other doesn't, but both are really morbid and introspective. Well, in a portion of the Ether called the Diapsalmata, he gives an image that you would expect from Nietzsche. He said, at a theater one evening, a fire broke out backstage, and one of the clowns came out onto the stage and announced to the audience that the theater was on fire. They thought it was a joke and they laughed. And he told them, no, really, the theater is on fire, you are in terrible peril. And the more he told them that, the funnier they thought it was, and the more they laughed. This is Kierkegaard's self-conception. He is a joker who is deadly serious, and you people are laughing at him thinking that he's a religious kook, when in fact you are in mortal terror. You are in mortal peril. You are going through the dark night of the soul. You are so detached from your souls you don't know it. What a horrifying situation. One horror after another. All of Kierkegaard's writing go from bad to worse. They're all entertaining, but they're all the product of a depraved mind. This image of the clown is perhaps one of the worst. Now let's try the better alternative. Let's try what it means to be the moral man. Well, if you're going to be the moral man, you're going to follow the dictates of conscience, follow the rules of morality, in a Kantian sense, but not for Kantian reasons. You're going to do it out of your lust, your passion for moral virtue, not because you worked out some kind of logical system that tells you that the CI, the categorical imperative, is really obligatory upon all rational agents. If you do it for that reason, you're really an aesthetic man, right? Because you're doing it because it pleases your vanity of thinking that you're such a clever guy. That's why he thinks that Kant, for that reason, is immoral, in the sense that he lacks faith and shores it up with rationality. He says, if you have the real thing, you have the real thing. And if you have the real thing, then what difference does it make whether it makes any sense? There's a great church father named Tertullian. You may have known him, or you may have heard of him. You couldn't have known him. He once said, I believe because it is absurd. There's a terrific perversity to that too. But that's the kind of a guy that's not willing to cut any sort of compromise between Athens and Jerusalem. Biblical belief comes first, and it is exclusive of all other beliefs. The Lord thy God is a jealous God. Thou shalt not have strange gods before me. The idol of reason is a strange god. So for that reason, the moral man will pursue morality with a passion. Again, this harks back to the romanticism that we find there. Not on the basis of some cogitation, but because he has made the criterionless choice. He has chosen the or rather than the either. Why did he do it? There's nothing to say. This is what he's chosen. This is the best that human life has to offer. The simple, primary commitment to righteousness, independent of pleasure, independent of rationality, independent of any possible alternative. There is a fierceness, a fanaticism to this, which again is kind of appalling if you stop and think about what kind of a guy we're talking about. And I'll try and get across to you the degree of fanaticism that attaches to this, because in some respects he formulates a very interesting system, and in fact there seems to be a certain method to this madness. There is a certain degree of logic and reason to it. It's just that the point here, as in the case of so many romantic writers and romantic artists, is that they want to go beyond reason to some transcendent realm that you get access to or that you connect to on the basis of some primary intuition rather than any activity of rational analysis. One of the great romantic thinkers in that respect. Now, in order to get across to you the difference between the either and the or, and in order to get across to you the difference between, say, the Enlightenment and Romanticism, in order to get across to you the difference between Kant and Kierkegaard, I think we should choose to examine the theology of these two gentlemen, Kant and Kierkegaard, because they are perfect paradigms of the kind of thinking that they represent. And fortunately for us, Kant and Kierkegaard were considerate enough to both make comments about the same biblical story, at least one of them, maybe more than one, but there's at least one biblical story that both of them talk about, and it connects the problems of faith and reason in a way that highlights both the advantages and disadvantages of either position. This is the story of Abraham. You may have heard of this. It's at the beginning of the Bible, right early on in the book, so if you haven't finished it, well, you perhaps have seen this particular story. Here's the deal. Abraham is a shepherd, and God makes a covenant with him, chooses Abraham, and says, Abraham, all right, you and your descendants are going to be a chosen people. I have a special connection with you. And to do you a big favor, since you're 100 and your wife Sarah is 90, I'm going to send you a child. Now, I don't know how Sarah felt about that at 90 years of age. She may not have thought of it as much of a great gift, but Abraham is very pleased with the gift. And then later on in the story, God appears to Abraham, and God says, Abraham, in his own inscrutable way, God says, I want you to sacrifice your son. No explanation, no explication, no justification, just God told him to do this. Now the question is, what are we supposed to think about things like that? Shall we take it in an allegorical way? Shall we take it literally? What are we supposed to think about a God who gives you things like a family, and then who, for no obvious reason, who in a rather capricious way decides to tell you, now kill him. He's your only son, destroy him, as a way of showing how much you like me. It's a horrifying choice. Now Kant has a very interesting read on that, and it's in a footnote, maybe the greatest footnote in the history of philosophy. It's in a book called Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, which is a typically Kantian idea, right? I mean, I could almost just tell you the title of it, and you could probably pick out that Kant is the kind of guy who would write a book like that. And what he says in this footnote, very important footnote, rather pregnant, is that if it were the case that God should appear to us by some miracle, literally speaking, we couldn't just fall down on our knees and do what God told us. We'd have to stop and ask ourselves, is this really God? I mean, that's the kind of thing a rationalist does. When God appears to me, he asks, who are you? Right? The kind of free, enlightened rationality characteristic of the Enlightenment, well, I want to know who I'm talking to first. Now, one assumes, I mean, God has never talked to me, so I'm not sure about this. But my sense is, and this is Kierkegaard's sense, that when you see him, you know what you're looking at, right? I mean, there's got to be something special about his properties in a visible sense that would let you know that you're dealing with something unusual. But that's not enough for Kant, because he wants rational certainty. So Kant says, in order to find out if this big thing of light, or the burning bush, or whatever it is that's talking to you, is really God, you've got to find out if he really has the properties of God. And what properties does God have? Well, he's perfectly rational, and he's perfectly free. You can't imagine him being unfree. You can't imagine him being irrational. It's like saying God is a lisp, right? So he's perfectly free, perfectly rational, perfectly knowledgeable, perfectly good, perfectly virtuous. That means he always follows the categorical imperative. Why? Because there's only one rule for moral behavior. It's true for individual human beings, it's true for nations, but it's also true for God and the angels. This goes all the way up the hierarchy, right to the boss. And you know he's God because he's perfectly free and perfectly rational, which means that he's perfectly autonomous, he's never heteronymous, he's never moved by anger or jealousy or anything like that. He's the perfect Kantian. In other words, you'll know you're talking to God when everything he tells you to do is consistent with the categorical imperative. If some big bright ball of light should ever start talking to you and tells you to do anything that's inconsistent with the categorical imperative, you know you're talking to the devil or one of the devil's pals, because God never violates the categorical imperative. God can't do that. It's not that he can't do that, it's the wrong way to think about it, but that blasphemous utterance comes close to being the rationalistic conception of God. God, by virtue of his very nature, by his freedom, by his knowledge, by his goodness, always obeys the categorical imperative. Elsewise you'd be saying that he was vicious and unfree. So now, let's stop and think about this ball of light that's telling me to sacrifice my son. Can I universalize the maxim? Could I wish that everybody should sacrifice their son whenever a ball of light talks to them? No. So that means that this is inconsistent with the CI. And if it's inconsistent with the categorical imperative, it's not God, because God always obeys the categorical imperative. So whenever burning bushes or balls of light, whatever it is that starts talking to you, make sure that you test it with the categorical imperative. That's the ultimate rule of morals. And that never can let you down. There is an element of Promethean Greek rationality in the Kantian view, which is rather impious. Who are you to question God? Who are you to tell God what the rules are? He's God. There is an element here of rationality, of a limitation of faith, which is not consistent with the simple arbitrary subjection to the will of God, which is characteristic of the most vehement, perhaps the most fanatical of religious believers. Tertullian, I believe because it is absurd. Kant would wince to hear that. kind of a belief is that? Any God worth believing in is going to be rational. I mean, that's part of what makes him virtuous. Think about the Kantian conception of morality, and then you think about the Kantian conception of God, and you're going to find out that Kant's God is a Prussian. Kant's God likes moral rules just for the sake of having them. He likes rules and he obeys them perfectly, which is what a Prussian God would do. In other words, Kant's God looks remarkably like Kant with all his vices taken away. In other words, he's the super Kant. He always obeys the CI. Now, let's look at the other alternative from the perspective of Kierkegaard, the romantic approach. All right? And this is in a section of a book called Fear and Trembling, which is the kind of charming title that Kierkegaard often gives to his books. There's another one called The Concept of Dread. I think you'll like that. That's a real page-turner. All right? Anxiety, despair, that kind of thing. You can see how Sartre's going to get the cue for nausea out of this. I mean, think of something really horrible and write a book about it, or tell us that that's the human condition. Well, that's essentially what Kierkegaard does. He says in Fear and Trembling is a long passage about Abraham and what a great guy Abraham is. Why? He doesn't sit there and ask God questions. God tells him to do something, he goes do it. That's it. That's what religious faith means. No compromises, no nonsense, none of this Greek rational stuff, none of this presumptuous categorical imperative business. God told me to do something, I'm going to go do it. That's what's great about Abraham. Now, Kierkegaard says not only is that great, but he goes on for about 40 pages telling us what a tremendous thing this is to do. And then he points out that this is unethical. I mean, literally speaking, that killing your son is the kind of thing that most sane people think is an evil, and actually Kierkegaard himself does. And here's where he makes what might be thought of as an addendum to his theory. It appears that it's not just a two-part separation between the aesthetic and the moral life. It appears that once you get into the moral life, once you make that transition from the either to the or, what you get is the possibility for further ultimate and complete transcendence, complete submission to the will of God. And that comes in when we move from the moral life to the religious life, to the life of simple but profound faith which brooks no obstacles and will not even slow down for considerations of rational calculation. So in other words, what Kierkegaard says is that Abraham was one of the great men of faith, one of the great religious figures in the world, precisely because what he is doing makes no sense. If it made sense, it wouldn't be nearly so good. Can you see, first of all, the romantic elements here, the rejection of rationality, the rejection of reasonable order, the rejection of the Greek humanism that's built right into the Enlightenment project? What he is saying is, on this rock I will build my religious faith. I am going to be the faithful man of God. The comparison between Kierkegaard and Job is not facetious. He is a modern Job. The Enlightenment thinkers like Kant have some of the are in some respects like Job's wife and Job's friends who tell him, you ought to blaspheme if God isn't doing what you expect him to do, what you want him to do. Kierkegaard, like Job, says, no. There's only one God, and he's what he is, and I am what I am. I'm, relatively speaking, an insect, a worm. I'm not going to tell God how to run the universe. So if God appears to me one day, I wouldn't hold your breath on that, but if he does ever appear to me one day, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do exactly what he tells me. I'm not going to ask him, is this consistent with the categorical imperative? I'm not going to interrogate him. I'm not going to ask him, are you sure you're running the world right? Because he's God. And once you make that fundamental decision, then you have the true life of faith. You've transcended simple ethical orientations towards the world and gotten to the true religious orientation. So Abraham is the perfectly religious man, the man of faith, and Abraham is the man who has made the either-or choice. And he says, hey, look, it's not pretty. If you wanted something pretty, if you wanted something fun, if you wanted to enjoy yourself, back to the aesthetic life with you. This is agonizing. In other words, not only does he say that Abraham has to agonize and go through all kinds of anguish in thinking about killing his own son, who's the pride of his life, is the source of his happiness, the greatest benefit God has given him. And now for apparently no reason at all, on some sort of a whim, and in this case, God never explains to him why he wants him to kill his son. He says, now God inexplicably wants me to kill him. I'm going to kill my own son. One of the greatest crimes, one of the greatest moral transgressions that you can imagine, this is testimony to the enormous power and the awful majesty of God. Morals come from him, they don't run him. We judge whether things are virtuous or good by virtue of whether they are derived from God or not. Anything which is not derived directly from the will of the Almighty, directly from His authoritative revelation, is simply either wrong or superfluous. Faith by itself is sufficient. What is it that Luther says? Faith alone will save us? Well, he takes Luther's idea of faith alone. He takes Luther's idea that we must, what is it Luther writes? The believing Christian must pluck out the eyes of his reason. And Kierkegaard says, yeah, that's a great idea. By doing that, you show how humble you are. You refrain from that Promethean pride which says, I'm going to be just as rational as God. Instead, you do what you're told because that's your position in the world. That's what the real human condition is. What's agonizing about this is that the same God that gave us the capacity to reason put us in a circumstance where reasoning won't help us. Because we have to make the criterionless choice between the either and the or. And there is no rational procedure which can allow you to choose between one and the other. So for Kierkegaard, we live in a grim and rather macabre world. There is a terrific amount of misery and pain and irony connected with the best of human lives. The price for escaping the aesthetic life, for escaping boredom, is a life of absolute fidelity to God, and that means that you may well be called upon to do things that are exceedingly unpleasant, even unto the murder of your own child. Kierkegaard says, let us be direct. If we judge Abraham by ethical standards, the man who is willing to kill his own child is a criminal. If we judge him by religious standards, by the single test of faith in God, there is no better man. Either or, make the choice. And he's not pulling any punches. He's not trying to make it look as if the set of either or choices that we make is going to be easy. And he explicitly tells you that it will be unpleasant, perhaps it will even be gruesome. And that's the best you can hope for. This is what the human condition is. There's a strain of philosophical melancholy in Kierkegaard, a forlornness, a kind of anguish, which is very much modern, which seems almost a part of the 20th century. The strange religious formulations are not in keeping with this century, I'll grant that. But the idea that truth is subjectivity, one of Kierkegaard's favorite terms, instead of the drive for objectivity and certainty and rational proof, characteristic of the thinkers of the Enlightenment, Kierkegaard says no, like any good romantic, truth is subjectivity. I myself will become a person by understanding the choices that I'm confronted with and making them, simply on the basis of my own, what he calls, leap of faith. How will we jump across this criterionless barrier? You must make the leap of faith, and there's no way of telling whether you will make the crossing safe. No proof, no certainty, no final explanations. God perhaps has his reasons. The man of faith believes that. But in fact, there's no way to tell. We live in a frightening, horrific world where we are faced with miserable, soul-wrenching choices that ultimately amount to a flip of the philosophical coin. The emphasis on subjectivity, the loss of certainty, the loss of orientation, the argument that essentially there is no ultimate rule, no ultimate rational algorithm which will allow us to discern good from evil, which will allow us to decide what the best and most virtuous life is. These are exceedingly modern ideas. Many of the important thoughts taken by the existentialists like Heidegger and Sartre and Camus and Marcel are all homage to Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, for all his religious craziness, has forced us to stop and think about the implications of being free, autonomous, rational subjects. When we move into the age of Romanticism and also into the age of the 20th century, the age of anxiety, if you want to call it that, we are faced with simple subjective choices which have no decision procedure. We are forced to make either-or decisions, perhaps not of the fundamental significance of the choice of the aesthetic or the ethical life, but we are faced with choices, many choices, which we are informed have no rational grounding. And that means we are set adrift in a realm of whim, in an area of opinion, of feeling, of taste, of sentiment, which is what Kant described as a wretched anthropology. There is no up, there is no down. You take your best shot and you live the life you choose. This is what Kierkegaard offers to us, a rather grim perspective on the world, justified perhaps by the fact that it makes us think, that it increases our own consciousness. I would be very worried for you if you made all the same decisions as Kierkegaard. I'm not trying to persuade you to do that, but I am trying to persuade you that this is the kind of problem that you do have to confront. It may well be, and I have a hunch that it's the case, that not all the important decisions in life offer us a rational decision procedure. Many of the important elements in human wisdom are not derived from any algorithm. They are derived from experience, from acting on your hunches maybe, from doing the best you can, muddling through a world that is obscure, unclear, and not perfectly delineated by the light of reason. Kierkegaard, in that respect, is a contemporary of ours. He understands what it's like not to know up from down. He understands moral confusion probably better than any of us. He offers us an alternative that, if it's not the only alternative we might want to choose, it's certainly intriguing. And if you even don't like the set of moral alternatives that he lives with us, that he offers us, then I recommend that you just have a look at the either or, and try the either, because you're probably an aesthetic person. Have a look at either or simply because of its remarkable literary qualities. There are very few authors who can project their mind into the consciousness of a hypothetical other person better than Kierkegaard when he writes about what it's like to be an aesthetic individual. A fascinating piece of work. I particularly recommend a piece called The Diary of the Seducer, which is very much in keeping with the aesthetic man. Kierkegaard, then, one of the great romantic theologians, one of the great reactions to Hegel, one of the few early 19th century writers whose work still has a considerable, direct, acknowledged influence on the philosophical writing that is characteristic of living philosophers today.